Rinelle Moraine stood over her daughter's lifeless body, eyes dry, voice steady, and claimed that her 2-year-old son, Deyren, was the killer. In that moment, what began as a tragedy twisted into something far darker, setting off a chilling investigation that would expose the horrifying truth of what really happened inside the Moraine household. Rinelle Moraine was the kind of mother who never missed a moment for a photo. Her social media pages were filled with carefully filtered images of her daughter, Calira, and her baby boy, Deyren. In every picture, they looked like a happy little family, smiling at the park, holding hands at the grocery store, playing with bubbles in the backyard. To anyone scrolling past, they looked perfect. Rinelle, only 27, had built a life for herself and her children in the quiet suburb of Silvershade, Kansas. She worked part-time as a home health aide and took online classes for a nursing degree. Her small 2-bedroom home was modest but neat, with flower beds out front and toys scattered across the lawn. Neighbours described her as quiet but polite. She didn't mingle much but always smiled when spoken to. They often saw her walking to the nearby daycare centre or pushing a double stroller to the community library. From the outside, there was no sign that anything was wrong. But as with many homes, the silence outside didn't match the chaos inside. Rinelle had no close family nearby. She had moved to Silvershade after separating from her ex-partner, whose identity she never shared with neighbours. She claimed he had abandoned the family, leaving her to raise the children alone. Her friends, what few she had, noticed she had become more withdrawn in recent months. She rarely answered messages, turned down invitations, and stopped posting selfies, choosing instead to share only photos of her kids. Behind that digital smile was a woman stretched thin by loneliness, stress, and hidden anger. The cracks in her world started showing long before anyone noticed. She had missed multiple appointments with social services after a report was made by Calira's preschool teacher, who noticed bruises on the little girl's arms. When confronted, Rinelle claimed her daughter was clumsy, often falling during playtime. The case was investigated briefly, but with no concrete evidence and a convincing explanation from Rinelle, it was closed. What no one knew was that Rinelle was buckling under pressure. Financial strain had been building since she lost one of her clients. Her bills were stacking up, eviction notices were appearing in the mail, and she was quietly battling depression. At night, she would sit alone in the bathroom, scrolling through online forums where other struggling mothers vented about the overwhelming pressure of motherhood. She began to latch on to these dark spaces where women posted anonymously about their feelings of resentment, guilt, and rage. Rinelle found a kind of comfort in their words. It gave her the illusion that she wasn't alone. Calira, at just 5 years old, was a bright and curious child who loved singing nursery rhymes and dressing up in mismatched clothes. But to Rinelle, she had become a source of daily frustration. She talked too much, asked too many questions, and sometimes refused to eat or sleep on time. On the other hand, Deyren was quiet and obedient. He didn't ask questions and rarely cried. In Rinelle's unstable mind, he was easier to manage, easier to love. That winter had been particularly hard. With temperatures dropping, the children were mostly kept indoors. Rinelle's temper grew shorter, her patience thinner. No one heard the shouts, the crying, or the soft thuds behind closed doors. No one saw the tiny bruises that Calira began to hide under her sleeves. No one noticed how her once joyful personality started to fade. The morning of the tragedy was quiet, like every other. Rinelle called 911 just before 8:30 a.m., her voice calm but frantic, claiming she had found her daughter unconscious in the bathroom. She told the dispatcher she had been cleaning downstairs when she heard a loud thump. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Calira was already gone. The silence in that house now echoed with questions that would soon reveal a darkness no one could have imagined behind the doors of a home that once seemed picture-perfect. Calira's lifeless body was discovered sprawled on the bathroom floor, just beside the tub. She was dressed in a faded pink nightgown, and her small hands were clenched into loose fists. Paramedics found no signs of recent illness, no obvious reason for a healthy 5-year-old to suddenly die. But what they did notice immediately were the bruises. There were fresh marks around her neck and shoulders, along with discoloration on her back and thighs. A paramedic quietly noted that the injuries appeared older than just a few hours. Something wasn't right. Rinelle stood nearby, wringing her hands, her eyes darting between the responders and the hallway. When asked what had happened, she hesitated. Then she offered a strange explanation. She believed her 2-year-old son, Deyren, had been playing too rough with his sister and might have caused the accident. According to her, she had left them unsupervised in the bathroom for just a few minutes while she vacuumed downstairs. She said she heard a loud bang, rushed upstairs, and found Calira on the floor, unresponsive. Detectives were called in shortly after. From the moment they stepped inside the Moraine home, they began documenting everything. The bathroom had no signs of a slip or fall. There was no blood spatter, no overturned furniture, and no objects heavy enough nearby that could have caused the injuries observed. But what stood out more than anything was the calmness in Rinelle's voice. She wasn't crying, wasn't hysterical. She answered every question clearly, even when talking about her dead daughter. Her story, though seemingly straightforward, raised red flags. At the hospital, the medical examiner began a full autopsy. What was discovered would change the direction of the case entirely. Calira had suffered a blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, significant enough to cause immediate unconsciousness. There was also evidence of older injuries, healed rib fractures, bruises in various stages of healing, and a dislocated shoulder that had never been properly treated. The mark on her neck was identified as consistent with a cord or belt, something that could not have been done by a toddler. Detectives returned to the home with a warrant. This time they took their time, photographing every room, collecting any items that could be considered weapons or evidence. In Calira's small bedroom, they found a stuffed toy with a torn ear and faded blood on its fabric. In the bathroom cabinet, they found children's bandages, antiseptic cream, and a small wooden spoon stained with something brownish red. It was taken for testing. Rinelle was brought in for further questioning. Her demeanour remained composed. She again blamed Deyren, insisting that he was stronger than most kids his age and had recently started throwing things when upset. She said she had been too tired to notice how aggressive his behaviour had become. Her statements were delivered with clinical precision, but investigators noticed she never once asked what would happen to her son now that his sister was gone. Child Protective Services quickly placed Deyren in temporary foster care. When evaluated by pediatric specialists, the little boy appeared developmentally behind. He barely spoke and showed signs of extreme anxiety when separated from familiar objects. Most chillingly, he flinched when adults moved toward him too quickly. Now, public opinion had begun to form. News of the case spread through local media. Mother blames toddler for sister's death. The headlines read. Social media lit up with anger and disbelief. People couldn't understand how anyone could point fingers at a 2-year-old. But the case was far from resolved. Authorities needed more than just suspicion. They needed solid evidence to prove whether Rinelle was lying, or if, in the most twisted of circumstances, she was telling the truth. Meanwhile, the autopsy report was finalized. The blow that killed Calira required far more strength than any 2-year-old could possess. It was the kind of injury delivered with force, intent, and precision. Detectives were now convinced. Calira had not died in an accident. She had been murdered. And the evidence increasingly pointed to the one person who claimed she wasn't even in the room. As the investigation moved forward, the full weight of Rinelle Moraine's disturbing claims began to take shape. The idea that a 2-year-old child could be responsible for the violent death of his older sister was so outlandish that it had law enforcement, psychologists, and even child development experts deeply unsettled. Yet Rinelle stuck to her story with unwavering certainty. She said Deyren had been acting out lately, throwing tantrums, hitting objects, and once nearly hurting a neighbor's cat. She described him as a troubled child, someone prone to fits of rage. But those who knew Deyren described a quiet, emotionally flat toddler who mostly clung to his mother's leg in public and barely spoke at all. There was no record of behavioral issues, no complaints from daycare, and no known injuries he had caused. With Rinelle unwilling to budge, detectives took a deeper look into her past and psychological state. They uncovered that she had been referred for mental health counselling twice in the past year by her healthcare employer. Once for excessive absenteeism, and once after a co-worker noticed her sobbing uncontrollably in her car during work hours. She never followed through with the counselling. More concerning, however, were her digital footprints. Investigators retrieved her phone and laptop and discovered a string of alarming internet searches. She had looked up phrases like how to cover bruises on kids, what to do if a child lies to you every day, how long after head trauma can a child die, and can a toddler be held responsible for an accident. The most disturbing search had been typed in 2 days before Calira's death. What's the youngest age you can be charged with murder? The evidence painted a troubling picture of a mother not only unwell, but potentially calculating. Social media, once cheerful and curated, was now seen through a different lens. Investigators noticed that she had stopped posting photos of Calira weeks before her death, though pictures of Deyren continued. To them, this seemed like an emotional detachment, perhaps something darker. When investigators traced her online activity further, they found she had been active on parenting forums under a pseudonym, venting about her children. Her posts were cold, filled with resentment, especially toward Calira. She referred to her as defiant, manipulative, and a liar who made my life hell, One post ended with a sentence that stunned everyone involved in the case. "Sometimes I wish she'd just go to sleep and never wake up." That chilling sentiment added fuel to the growing theory that Rinelle had long viewed Calira as a burden, not a child. But perhaps the most damning turn came when a former friend, Taylin Groves, contacted the police. Taylin had visited Rinelle's home a month before the murder and remembered something she couldn't shake. Calira had a black eye and a limp. When Taylin asked about it, Rinelle claimed Calira had fallen off the couch while dancing. She had laughed it off, but Taylin recalled how quiet the girl had been, how she avoided eye contact. Now it all made sense. Detectives requested a second forensic sweep of the Moraine home. In Calira's closet, hidden behind piles of folded blankets, they discovered a spiral notebook filled with crayon scribbles. Among the pages were sad stick figures and a few haunting phrases written in a child's shaky handwriting. "I was bad. Mummy said no food. I fell again." It wasn't definitive evidence, but it was enough to break hearts and deepen suspicions. It was clear this little girl had been living in fear. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Rinelle continued to assert her innocence. She claimed the bruises were from accidental falls, that the notes were made during playtime, and that her internet searches were related to a parenting podcast she had been listening to. She insisted that the police were twisting things, that she was just a tired mother trying to do her best. But the more she explained, the less believable she became. The prosecution began building its case, and it became obvious they were going to focus not just on the crime, but on the months leading up to it. This was no one-time outburst. This was a pattern. A system of neglect, resentment, and silent rage that had ended in tragedy. And all the while, the only surviving witness to the crime was a 2-year-old boy who couldn't yet form the words to describe what he saw. The trial of Rinelle Moraine became one of the most emotionally charged events the town of Silvershade had ever seen. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Citizens lined up for a seat in the gallery, and parenting groups across the country debated every new development. Some saw Rinelle as a mentally unstable woman who had snapped under pressure. Others viewed her as a cold, calculating mother who had carefully planned the murder of her own child. But no one could look away. The question that haunted everyone was simple and chilling. Why would a mother blame her toddler son for a crime she committed? From the very first day in court, prosecutors painted a harrowing picture. They described a slow descent into abuse, a household ruled by silence and fear, and a mother who saw her daughter not as a blessing, but as an inconvenience. The prosecution presented the digital evidence first. Search histories, forum posts, and private messages that revealed a woman slowly unraveling. Screenshots of Rinelle's online activity were projected in court. "I hate the way she cries. He's the only one I can stand. Calira ruins everything." These words silenced the room. Next came the autopsy report. A medical examiner testified that Calira's injuries were not consistent with an accident or rough play. The pattern of trauma showed repeated, deliberate harm. He explained how the blow to her head required considerable force, far beyond what a 2-year-old could deliver. There was also testimony from pediatric specialists who confirmed that Deyren lacked the physical strength or coordination to have caused such injuries. But perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from a child psychologist who had evaluated Deyren. The toddler, though unable to speak in full sentences, had displayed signs of trauma through play-based therapy. When presented with dolls and household items, he reenacted scenes involving a small figure hiding from a larger one, followed by loud banging motions and whimpers. The psychologist explained that while not definitive, these actions were consistent with a child who had witnessed violence, but lacked the language to describe it. Rinelle's defense team argued that she was suffering from postpartum depression and chronic stress. They brought in their own expert to claim that her mental health issues clouded her judgment and led her to believe, however irrationally, that Deyren had harmed Calira. They emphasized her isolation, her lack of support, and her history of untreated anxiety. Her lawyer described her as a single mother at her breaking point, more deserving of treatment than punishment. But the jury wasn't convinced. They watched as Rinelle sat motionless, showing little emotion throughout the proceedings. She never looked at the photos of her daughter, never reacted to the autopsy details, and avoided eye contact with witnesses. When given the chance to speak, she declined. No apology, no explanation, just silence. One of the key moments in the trial came when Taylin Groves was called to testify. Her account of Calira's black eye, limp, and withdrawn behavior just weeks before the girl's death added emotional weight to the case. She told the court how she wished she had done more, how she thought about that visit every night, and how guilty she felt for not speaking up sooner. Her words brought many in the courtroom to tears. In the end, it was the combination of evidence, digital, forensic, and psychological, that formed a damning picture. A mother who not only harmed her child, but attempted to shift the blame onto her innocent son. The prosecution concluded their case by reminding the jury that Calira had no voice anymore, and Deyren couldn't speak for himself. It was up to the court to speak for them both. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Rinelle Moraine was found guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. No cries, no gasps, just a heavy shared understanding that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. But the damage done could never truly be undone. After the verdict, the town of Silvershade seemed to exhale for the first time in months. The case had drawn national attention, not only for its horrific details, but because of how deeply it challenged the idea of motherhood and innocence. Even with the conviction, the emotional wounds left behind would take years to heal, especially for the smallest victim who had survived, Deyren Moraine. The court sentenced Rinelle to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her lack of remorse and disturbing attempt to frame her toddler son weighed heavily on the judge's decision. But while justice had been served in a legal sense, the aftermath of the crime continued to ripple across the lives it touched. Calira's funeral had taken place in a small cemetery on a grey, windswept afternoon. The service was closed to the public, attended only by distant relatives and a few neighbours who had known the girl from school. Her tiny headstone was decorated with a carved butterfly and the words, "Forever our light." After the trial, Child Protective Services turned their focus to Deyren. Psychologists and trauma experts worked carefully with him, observing his behavior, helping him relearn how to feel safe. He was placed in the care of a foster family who had specialized experience with children from abusive homes. At first, Deyren barely spoke or responded to his name. He carried with him a small tattered blanket and clutched it wherever he went. Loud noises made him freeze. Sudden movements sent him running to corners. It would be months before he began to make eye contact, before he smiled. His foster family, the Harbrays, gave updates to the caseworkers weekly. They noted his slow but steady progress. With patience, structure and therapy, Deyren began to say small words. One of his first clear sentences was, "Calira gone." It was a breakthrough that left everyone in tears. No one pushed him for details. No one tried to make him remember what had happened. The goal was simple: to let him be a child again. Meanwhile, public response to the case remained fierce. Online forums and talk shows dissected every piece of the story. Parenting groups demanded stricter guidelines for child abuse monitoring, while lawmakers proposed new legislation that would require more rigorous mental health screenings for parents involved in past child welfare investigations. The name Rinelle Moraine became a symbol of maternal failure, of institutional blind spots, and of the silence that allowed a young girl to die unseen. But some in the town were haunted by guilt. Teachers, neighbours, even the mail carrier, who delivered letters to the Moraine house, all wondered if they had missed something. A bruise, a quiet plea, a distant look. Regret became a shared experience. Calira's memory was honoured in small, quiet ways. Her old kindergarten class planted a garden on school grounds. A local artist painted a mural of a girl with wide, hopeful eyes and the words, "You are seen, you are safe." Even years later, the case would be brought up whenever new reports of child abuse surfaced in the media. It served as a warning and a sorrowful reminder. Tragedy, especially involving children, rarely happens in total secrecy. There are always signs, whispers, warnings, and when those are ignored, the consequences are devastating. As for Deyren, his name was eventually changed to protect his identity. He grew up far from Silvershade, shielded from the media frenzy that had once surrounded his family. His therapists never told him the full story, only what he could handle with time. He would carry the scars of those early years for the rest of his life, but thanks to the compassion of others, he was given a chance to rebuild. The case of Rinelle Moraine was closed. The trial was over. But in the quiet spaces where grief still lived, in a garden planted by tiny hands, in a notebook filled with crayon scribbles, in the fearful eyes of a 2-year-old who survived the unthinkable, the story of Calira Moraine would never truly end.